Good morning. Chapter 25, Lecture A. We're getting on. We're moving right along. Hope you guys are all with us. There's a lot of things going on with the flood and everything. Hope you're hanging in there. If you need accommodations or help, let me know. But I think further east we go, the better. But yeah, right now we're hanging on by a thread. If you have not got Chapter 24 stuff wrapped up, please do so. The Chapter 24 quiz and reaction quiz have been posted for a while. They should be completed by today. Chapter 25 reaction quiz is posted now. This one is a watch a video and then reflect on it. It's Ken Burns, Vietnam, episode 6. Things Fall Apart. It's a really good episode. If you have not watched any of the Vietnam Ken Burns before, it is pretty good. There's a few minor things with it, but it's pretty good. So, Chapter 25, we're getting into the 60s. Focus questions we're going to talk about: what were the major events of the civil rights in the early 60s? What were the major crises of policy and initiatives of the Kennedy presidency? What were the purpose and strategy of Johnson's Great Society? How did the civil rights movement change? How did the Vietnam War transform the American politics and culture? What were the sources of significance of the rights? What was basically the revolution, other revolutions outside the civil rights? And in what ways was 68 a climactic year? 1968, you're going to find, when you watch the video, is the biggest impact on really the 60s. A lot of events happened that year. The Civil Rights Revolution. I'll let you read that for a second. Big thing from this is the rising tide of protest. Americans are going to actively start protesting, the African Americans, I should say. It's going to start with, obviously we talked about Rosa Parks in the 50s, but it's going to really start with the sit-ins in 1960 at Greensboro, a Woolworth department store. Basically, these kids have been denied access to eat at an all-white counter, and they're going to set in. In April of 1860, the creation of the SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, dedicated to replacing the culture of segregation with a beloved community of racial justice and to empowering ordinary blacks to take control of the decisions. They are going to literally just set at the cafe. It's why it's called a set-in. They're going to have stuff dumped on them, and etc., but they are looking at a non-violent way. In 1961, CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, launched the Freedom Rides. Integrated groups traveled by bus into the Deep South to test compliance of court orders banning segregation on interstate buses and trains and terminal facilities. Violent mobs will often assault them. So on these Freedom Rides, the second group that's called CORE, they're going to be assaulted by and be arrested often for seeing if they could travel via buses and stuff non-segregated. I should add one thing before I get too much into the 60s. Rosa Parks, she was arrested for setting, we talked about last week, was setting on a bus. A couple years before her, there was a guy named Emmett Till, and you've taken my American history class, I talk about him a little bit. Emmett Till was a teenage boy who was, I believe, Mississippi, went to visit his uncle, was down there for the summer, probably was a little bit, a typical teenage boy, had said something to a white woman.
He looked at her.
I think he just looked at her, maybe winked, smiled, did something like a teenage boy would do. He was hunted down by a lynch mob, killed, shot in the head. His body was thrown into a river. Really, really graphic. He's a straight-up murdered. They think that is the launch of the civil rights movement, because after that, African Americans start standing up. Then Rosa Parks happens, and now we get to the 1960. You start seeing the set-ins with the creation of SNCC, the nonviolence group, CORE, and then in 1962, court ordered the University of Mississippi to attend Ole Miss. What was interesting about that was Kennedy had to also issue troops to protect James Meredith going to college. Civil Rights Revolution 2. High point of protest came in 63. In 1 week, more than 15,000 arrests in 186 cities across the country. Martin Luther King Jr. was invited to come to Birmingham. He served a 9-day prison sentence and wrote his famous letter from Birmingham jail. King made the decision to send school children into the streets. Police Chief Eugene Bull O'Connor unleashed his forces against the young marchers. TV captured the brutality, and revulsion came from around the world. Local business leaders agreed to desegregate the downtown stores. In June of '63, a sniper killed Medgar Evans, secretary of the NAACP in Mississippi. In September, a bomb exploded in a Black Baptist church, killing 4 young girls, and the last conviction did not come till 2002 in that bombing. So '63 is a pretty high point, right? Birmingham, King comes. King represents the civil rights movement. He's a Southern Baptist preacher, very passionate, charismatic, very has a lot of charisma, very elegant speaker. But the biggest thing about him is he preaches nonviolence. He does not want to be violent. And when they send the young people into the streets, he knew tactically that if they attacked those kids, that it would be the best thing that could happen to their movement. And he was rightfully so. It did galvanize the world. Little kids are being hosed down of hoses, hit by police officers. Completely shifts the dynamic of the movement. March on Washington, 1963, 250,000 black and white Americans converged on the nation's capital for the March on Washington. King gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech, and movement did face some internal tensions, but this is where the apex of things start to change dramatically in the civil rights movement. Now, there's a lot more detail we could go into here, but you can see by '63 things are in motion now where changes are starting to happen. But there's resistance to it, especially in the South, with the bombing of the church, the arrest. There's going to be always resistance in the South, especially against this flood of changes. Famous photo, famous speech, obviously, on the Washington Monument when Martin Luther King Jr. gave "I Have a Dream" speech. The Kennedy years won. Now, as the civil rights movement's going, we have a new president, JFK. Now, the Kennedy years. Kennedy was president for less than 3 years and didn't have a lot of accomplishments before his presidency. But today is viewed as a moment of youthful glamour, soaring hopes, and dynamic leadership at home and abroad. Kennedy in the world. He wanted a vigorous conduct of the Cold War. He wanted to take on the Cold War and win it. He established the Peace Corps, improve America's image across the world. He wanted to make sure America was projected in a good light. And obviously the Peace Corps goes around the world helping impoverished nations. After Soviets launched a man in space, he declared the United States would put a man on the moon by the end of the decade. He viewed the world through the lens of the Cold War. Cuba had been seized by communist Fidel Castro and authorized the Bay of Pigs invasion, which was a complete failure. So early in his presidency, he has an utter complete failure when they tried to overthrow Castro in Cuba. But before I move on to more about Cuba, his speech, taking a man to the moon, really transformed America in the 60s. And after his death, LBJ and Nixon, both successors to Kennedy, made it one of their tenets to put a man on the moon. And so through the 60s, America's space program greatly expands, and in 1969 we fulfill that dream by putting a man on the moon to fulfill Kennedy's accomplishment. So he was young, very proactive, wanted to change, put his input on the world. However, his Bay of Pigs failure is going to prompt a later incursion with Cuba that is more dramatic. Early in his couple years into his presidency, he's going to have to deal with what's called the Cuban Missile Crisis, one of the most dramatic events in American history. In 1961, a stem of growing tide of immigrants fleeing from east to west Berlin, the Soviets constructed the Berlin Wall. The point of the Berlin Wall was to keep not people out, but keep people from leaving, which is counterproductive to the wall. So there was tensions in Europe when the wall went up, because it literally split Berlin in half, and that wall also excluded all of Eastern Europeans. So now you have a bunch of Eastern Europeans that cannot get to Western Europe. Families will be torn apart in Berlin. The wall went up overnight, by the way. In October of '62, Americans found there was missiles in Cuba. This was found by a U-2 spy plane. Kennedy imposed a blockade on Cuba until they removed the weapons. For 13 days, I think it is. There's a movie called 13 Days. The world stood at an edge. Literally, we were minutes away from nuclear war. The Soviets were prepared, we were prepared. It took dialogue between the premier of the Soviet Union, Khrushchev, and JFK, writing letters to each other that averted war. Soviet generals, American generals wanted to go to war. I mean, we were within minutes. Kennedy's blockade was a brilliant move because when we blockaded, saying we will blockade Cuba until you remove the weapons, this forced the Soviets that if they went and hit the blockade, they would have started the war, which would have been a PR nightmare. So that forces the Soviets to back down. There is one fatality during this short event. An American pilot is shot down and killed over Cuba. I think it was a spy plane. That being said, we escaped this without a major war event. 1963 agreed to abandon testing nuclear weapons in the atmosphere and space, which is significant because at this point we were both looking at possibly testing nuclear warheads not just on the ground but in space. Now, as the Bay of Pigs was a failure, the Cuban Missile Crisis was a huge success for Kennedy. He showed his resolve and he won the international and domestic stance on it. Kennedy and civil rights. First 2 years he did not deal much with civil rights, but after Birmingham 63 he called for a law banning discrimination in places of public accommodation. He did not live to see the civil rights bill passed, but he definitely supported it. There's other things Kennedy did, but he did dive into civil rights, Cuban Missile Crisis, putting a man on the moon. Those were his big accomplishments. And then in 63, November 22nd, not 2nd, November 22nd, he will be assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald in Dallas, Texas. There's a lot of debate on his assassination. We can spend hours, days, months, years talking about it. But he will be assassinated regardless, and the official narrative is by Lee Harvey Oswald. His Vice President, Lyndon B. Johnson, or LBJ, will take over on the plane back to D.C. Now, U.S. blockades Cuba, tells Rush lay off. You can see some of the headlines of the 1963 Cuban Missile Crisis. Obviously paints Kennedy as a cool cat. When you look at his photo right there, you can see he looks calm, collective. And all that paper is dealing with his Cold War issues. Here's a photo of Kennedy right before he was killed. This is leading up to the curve in the corner where he will be shot. He had been warned to have a bulletproof. There was a bulletproof hardtop to that. I think it's a Lincoln, but he refused to have it on. He wanted it off so the people could see him and he could see the people. But yeah, if he had the bulletproof top on, he would have most likely not been killed. Okay, Lyndon Johnson's presidency won. Johnson took over. One of his first big things is obviously replacing Kennedy, but is the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Congress passed it, prohibited racial discrimination in employment institutions like hospitals, schools, and privately owned public accommodations such as restaurants, hotels, and theaters. And ironically enough, to get it passed, they had to invoke the Commerce Clause of the Constitution, saying that the civil rights, if you basically kept people from staying at your hotel, you were interfering with commerce across state lines. The Freedom Summer, the CRA did not address the right to vote in the South, though. The Civil Rights Amendment, or Act. Hundreds flocked to the South to help blacks register to vote. Met with violence and some cases death. People that even whites that came down to support this were often harassed and even killed. It led to the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, the MFDP, wanted to take seats at the state's all-white official party at the 1964 Democratic Convention in Atlantic City. Fannie Lou Hamer held a national audience spellbound of her account of growing up in the South. They were offered 2 black delegate seats. They rejected them because they wanted more to account for what their population was. The point of this was the Democratic Party, who had been championing African Americans, was very slow to expand their rights or expand them even into the party itself. And Lyndon Johnson did not want this to be a distraction from the election. The 1964 election. Events in Atlantic City weakened black activists' faith in the party. Barry Goldwater of Arizona demanded more aggressive conduct of the Cold War, and he was a Republican. He basically did a doomsday speech. Voted against the Civil Rights Act, stated extremism and defense of liberty is no vice. He did not like rioting or protest, etc. Stigmatized by the Democrats and extremists who would repeal Social Security and risk nuclear war, Goldwater went down to a disastrous defeat. He was kind of a loose-end candidate. He did carry 5 deep South states, though, because he's premise of basically not wanting to promote the Civil Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act. In 1965, King launched the Voting Rights campaign in Selma, Alabama, that, if you've seen the movie Selma, deals with. Governor Wallace banned them from marching in Montgomery, attempted to block them at the bridge, and violence once again was on TV. Johnson asked Congress to enact the law securing the right to vote. The Voting Rights Act of 65 allowed federal officials to register voters, and then shortly thereafter they passed what's known as the 24th Amendment, which bans poll tax or any hereditary tax or anything like that. So, Johnson, though he was kind of reluctant at times, becomes a champion of the civil rights movement by carrying out some of the key elements, key legislation, and supporting. Now, he was a political man, so he tried to make himself look good through the whole process. But Selma once again captured on television an outcry from across the country and across the world of people being brutally attacked by the police. Immigration reform. The Hart-Keller Act of 1865 abandoned the national orange quota system of immigrants, which excluded Asians and severely restricted Southern and Eastern Europeans. Established new racially neutral criteria for immigration, for a limitation of 120,000 from Western Hemisphere, though. Does have a dramatic effect on immigration. Obviously, with this whole shift, now we allow Asians and others to come in. It makes a whole broader spectrum. The Great Society, one thing that Johnson does is he pushes his own initiative from 65 to 67 called the Great Society. He wanted to end poverty. They will elect new programs called Medicare and Medicaid, which still exist. They're going to create the Equal Opportunity Commission, EEOC, or Equal Opportunity Office. Unlike the New Deal, the Great Society was a response to prosperity. So, we were very prosperous, but now they wanted to eliminate poverty at all levels, which is going to be called, obviously, part of the Great Deal, or the New Deal, or the Great Society. Lyndon Johnson's presidency, slide 4, is the war on poverty. It was the centerpiece and the crusade of the Great Society. It attributed the absence of skills and lack of proper attitudes and work habits. They're going to offer food stamps, direct aid to the poor. This is where your Head Start will be created for job training, legal, and helping poor students. Created Vista, a domestic version of the Peace Corps for the inner cities. Freedom and equality. Johnson understood that there was a difference between white and black poverty. White poverty was not near as bad as black poverty. He sought to redefine the relationship between freedom and equality. Succeeded in reducing the incidence of poverty from 22 to 13%. He helped narrow the gap between whites and blacks in education, income, and access, but nearly a quarter of all black children still lived in poverty. So it did not end poverty. It did reduce it, but was very expensive and at great cost. But the Great Society has a mixed feel if it was super successful at this day and age. Okay, got a couple more slides to be done for the day. The Changing Black Movement. Ghetto uprisings. In Harlem, 1964, first riots will start to appear. Really no riots before this, as far as with Martin Luther King's movement. However, really battles between angry blacks and a predominantly white police. That will be the Harlem riots. The Watts uprising in 65 Los Angeles, 50,000 took police and attacking police and firemen, and burning buildings and looting things. In 67, urban uprisings left 23 dead in Newark and 43 in Detroit. Violence led Johnson to appoint a commission headed by Governor Odo Kerner. He found segregation, poverty, and white racism were the causes. No solution to fix, though. He pinpointed the reasons: segregation, poverty, and white racism. Those are what's causing these riots. But he had no solution to fix it. In 66, King went to Chicago but failed to, again. Mayor Richard Daley, who was the very powerful mayor of Chicago, really put King out of reach where he could really do much effect. But the thing about this is these riots are not King's style. He's all about peaceful protest, nonviolent. There is growing groups within the black movement that want to be violent. One of them was Malcolm X. Malcolm Little was his actual name, was a fiery speaker. He was a spokesman for the Nation of Islam. He was Islamic. He was a Muslim. Sharp critic of the ideas of integration and nonviolence. He took a trip to Mecca, though, in 64. So he had been preaching violence, rioting. But he went there and saw harmony, and he begins to shift his perspective that maybe nonviolence is the best way and not violence. However, in 65, he'll be assassinated after creating a new organization, and this left no clear way moving forward for his group or even ideology, because he had been radical, he had been proactive on violence, but now he's shifting. He's killed by another Nation of Islam because there was disagreement there. He's going to rise, importance, now he's going to shift, and then he dies. And so Malcolm X could have been very, very impactful with helping basically be not a second Martin Luther King Jr., but have been another complement to him, but unfortunately he is killed. But this is going to lead to, so that what he kind of envisioned initially before he changed was Black Power. Malcolm X was the intellectual leader of Black Power, what becomes what we'll think of Black Panthers. The SNCC leaders, Stokely Carmichael, used it during a march in 66. The idea radicalized young civil rights activists and sparked an explosion of racial self-assertion. Black Power embraced the idea that the natural side of Africa. This is where you get the fro. Yes, if you look at a lot of 60s and 70s people with the giant fros, African colorful culture, Black Power is all about their African heritage, not the American way, the African heritage. And an offshoot of this is going to be Black Panthers, which are a very radical group. Okay, they kind of buy into the whole Malcolm X, we're going to use violence to get our way, and then Black Panther is incorporating a much strong African heritage history. This will create new militant groups and obviously the rise of the Black Panther. So you can see now the civil rights movement has a huge crossroads of where they're going to go from here. Are they going to become more violent, or are they going to remain peaceful and still relish what they have gotten? Okay, we will get into Vietnam tomorrow. We've covered a lot of ground today on the civil rights movement. There's far more we could talk about for hours and days, but I wanted to get a good jump on this week's lecture. I will not lecture tomorrow. Your reaction quiz is posted. Work on that. There's a video. Watch it. Write on it. I'll be back Wednesday, and then I'll be gone again Thursday. So I will try to get all my lecture done on Wednesday, or I'll have another lecture posted that you can listen to on your own. Have a great day.